G'day, mate. There's a pretty fundamental rule in nature that's gone pretty much unquestioned throughout Earth's history, and it's dead simple. Carnivores are dangerous, herbivores are not. This logic's been holding true for millions of years, and it still holds true today, with predators being universally feared, while grazers and browsers are often thought of as pretty harmless blokes, incapable of causing any real strife. However, like heaps of rules in nature, this one's got a notable exception, and that exception happened during a specific window in Earth's deep past, when the roles absolutely flipped and herbivores became the apex threats, while carnivores found themselves stuck playing the role of prey. This scenario sounds pretty bonkers to modern ears, but it actually happened, and it was truly one of the most bizarre and counterintuitive periods in prehistoric history.
The time period we're talking about happened during the early Triassic, which kicked off roughly 252 million years ago, straight after the Great Dying, the most catastrophic extinction event in Earth's history. The Great Dying had wiped out about 96% of all marine species and 70% of all vertebrate families, leaving the planet absolutely stuffed from ecological collapse. With ecosystems shattered and food chains obliterated, the creatures that made it through this apocalypse were scattered and traumatized, and it'd take millions of years before life could get back on its feet and rebuild.
But here's where it gets interesting. During these early millions of years of the Triassic, something extraordinary went down in certain regions, particularly in what's now South Africa and Argentina. The surviving herbivores didn't just bounce back to their old ecological roles. Instead, they underwent a massive transformation. Some of them evolved into absolutely colossal, powerful creatures that were way more formidable than the carnivores hunting alongside them. These were the Dicynodonts, and more specifically, during the earliest Triassic, they gave rise to some of the largest and most dominant land animals of that entire period. Creatures so massive and well-armed that they became the true bosses of their ecosystems.
To work out how this reversal actually came about, we've got to first understand what the early Triassic was actually like and why such an unusual situation could even happen. The world straight after the Great Dying was a wasteland in every possible sense. The oceans were stagnant and oxygen depleted, the climate was dodgy, swinging wildly between extreme heat and extreme cold, and the landscape itself was bare and desolate, with bugger-all plants and even fewer animals. The survivors were those creatures that could handle extreme conditions and breed really quickly.
In this situation, the typical predator-prey relationship absolutely collapsed because there just weren't enough small animals to keep large populations of carnivores going. The carnivores that did make it found themselves in a resource-starved environment, unable to hunt in coordinated groups like they might have done before, reduced to scavenging and hunting whatever scraps of prey they could find. Meanwhile, the herbivores faced a different problem. While plants were also hard to find, the herbivores that survived were the ones that could scoff down tough, fibrous vegetation and process it properly. They didn't need to hunt, they didn't need to fight violently with each other the way carnivores did, and most importantly, they didn't need to gather in big mobs to take down prey.
This fundamental difference in feeding strategy gave the herbivores an unexpected advantage in the post-extinction world. They could spread out across the landscape, scoffing on scattered vegetation, while carnivores struggled to find enough prey to keep going. And as the Triassic went on and life slowly began to bounce back, the herbivores grabbed this advantage and ran with it, or rather, they grew with it. The creatures that came to dominate the early and middle Triassic were the Dicynodonts, and among them were some truly massive forms. The largest and most impressive of these were the Lystrosaurids, a family of Dicynodonts that absolutely smashed it in terms of size and success during this period. The Lystrosaurus itself was the most abundant large animal of the earliest Triassic, found across Russia, Antarctica, Africa, and South America. Weighing around 200 kilograms and measuring nearly 2 meters in length. It was a stocky, tusked creature that looks a bit like a pretty weird cross between a pig and a hippo. But its true dominance came from its remarkable adaptability and toughness. However, Lystrosaurus, while successful, wasn't the largest Dicynodont. That honour belonged to creatures that showed up a bit later in the Triassic, such as Dicynodon itself, and more impressively, the Carnivores genus, which reached lengths of over 3 meters and weights exceeding 500 kilograms, making them bigger than most of the carnivores knocking about during their time. Carnivores was an absolutely massive creature, with a barrel-shaped body held up by sturdy columnar limbs and armed with a pair of huge tusks that could grow to be over 20 centimeters long. These weren't just for show, these were genuine weapons, capable of doing serious damage. What made Carnivores and its mates truly dangerous wasn't just their size, but their physiology and behaviour. These weren't passive, gentle grazers. Despite being herbivorous, they were territorial and aggressive creatures, with evidence suggesting they had a proper go at each other, using their tusks to fight for dominance and breeding rights. But more to the point, they didn't put up with predators very well. The carnivores of the early and middle Triassic were dominated by a group called the Cynodontia, more specifically a subgroup known as the Cynodonts proper. These creatures were therapsids like the Dicynodonts, and they inherited that family tree, but they'd evolved as predators, equipped with sharp teeth, powerful jaws, and athletic builds that let them hunt. However, compared to the massive Dicynodonts, heaps of cynodont predators were actually smaller, or at best the same size as their prey. Take the Thrinaxodon, for example, a relatively small cynodont that measured only about 50 centimeters long and weighed maybe a few kilograms at best. This creature probably hunted smaller animals and lizards, but would have been pretty harmless to a Lystrosaurus or a Carnivores, and faced with a full-grown Carnivores, any smaller cynodont predator would have been in real trouble. A creature weighing 500 kilograms with tusks and the behavioral aggression to use them would pose a fair dinkum threat to a predator weighing only a fraction of that.
Even the bigger cynodonts, like the Procinosuchus, which reached lengths of around 1.5 meters, found themselves in a tricky spot. The sheer abundance and size of Dicynodonts in their ecosystems meant that carnivores couldn't dominate through size or strength alone. They had to be clever, they had to hunt as a team, they had to target young Dicynodonts or crook ones, and they had to avoid having a blue with healthy adults whenever they could. This represented a massive reversal of how nature normally works. The herbivores weren't just surviving, they were absolutely thriving, and they were doing it partly because they were simply too big and too well armed for most carnivores to have a crack at successfully. And this trend would keep going throughout the Triassic, with Dicynodonts staying the dominant land vertebrates for millions of years. The biggest Dicynodonts only really starting to get fewer in numbers after early dinosaurs showed up and spread out, which had different advantages that let them outcompete the aging Dicynodont lineage. But the dominance of herbivores over carnivores during the early Triassic wasn't just about having heaps of big-tusked creatures. It went further into their ecological role and their behaviour in ways that absolutely changed how ecosystems worked during this time. Think about the territorial behaviour of Carnivores and its mates. These were aggressive creatures that actively defended territory, a behaviour pattern that would have kept carnivores out of massive chunks of decent habitat. Imagine being a small carnivore trying to hunt in an area claimed by a Carnivores mob. You'd cop constant conflict and aggression from the herbivores themselves, which would make the area pretty ordinary for predator populations. This meant that in heaps of regions, big Dicynodonts actually controlled the landscape, and predators had to hunt somewhere else or risk having a proper stoush. Additionally, the sheer number of Dicynodons in certain areas suggests they hogged resources in ways that made life pretty hard for carnivores. Fossil sites like the Lystrosaurus assemblage zone in South Africa show that Dicynodonts could make up 90% or more of all vertebrate fossils found.
This is a bonza figure that shows just how numerically dominant these herbivores were. When you've got such heaps of big herbivores in an ecosystem, the carnivores can't possibly hunt them all. In fact, the carnivores become almost useless to ecosystem function in some ways. The Dicynodonts were feeding themselves. They were eating vegetation at such a rate that they changed the very landscape, and the predators were just along for the ride.
There's also evidence that some Dicynodonts might have been semi-social creatures, living in mobs similar to modern hippos or elephants. If that's true, it would have made them even more dangerous, as group-living herbivores present a collective threat that individual predators just can't handle. A mob of Kennemyaria would have been an absolutely terrifying encounter for any Triassic carnivore, and the predators would have had to be extraordinarily skilled and coordinated to successfully hunt even a young one from such a mob.
Furthermore, the Dicynodonts weren't defenseless just from their tusks. Heaps of them also had powerful forelimbs and a generally sturdy build suited to aggressive scrapping. They could potentially gore, slash, and bludgeon a predator with multiple weapons at once, and their sheer mass would have given them massive advantages in any physical blow with a smaller carnivore. The only ways carnivores managed to hang on in these ecosystems was through specialisation and getting lucky. Some carnivores probably became specialist hunters of smaller vertebrates, leaving the Dicynodonts alone. Others might have been mainly scavengers, feeding on Dicynodonts that died naturally or got crook from environmental stress, and a select few might have hunted as a team or targeted very young or very old Dicynodonts in coordinated attacks. But these strategies were just band-aids on a much bigger problem. The herbivores had won the early Triassic, and the carnivores were forced to play second fiddle.
This unusual dominance of herbivores over carnivores stands in stark contrast to pretty much every other major ecosystem throughout Earth's history, and it stands in particular contrast to what came later, even after the Dicynodonts declined and dinosaurs took over. The predators quickly got their dominance back. The theropod dinosaurs became the apex predators of the Mesozoic, and they stayed that way until the end of the Cretaceous. And after the non-avian dinosaurs got wiped out, the mammalian carnivores took over and have stayed on top ever since. The early Triassic represents a unique moment in time, a moment that had never happened quite the same way again.
Why didn't this situation stick around? Why did carnivores eventually get their top spot back? The answer's in how evolution and adaptation work. As the Triassic went on and the climate settled down and vegetation recovered from the Great Dying, the selective pressures that favoured massive herbivores started to change. Early dinosaurs showed up, and these creatures had advantages that Dicynodonts didn't. They were bipedal, which let them be both big and nimble. They had different skeletal structures that let them have greater active metabolism. And they had a family tree that would eventually produce the apex predators of the Mesozoic. The theropod dinosaurs evolved as highly specialized predators with sharp teeth, powerful jaws, and aggressive hunting behaviors. They quickly became the dominant carnivores, and as they became more sophisticated and specialized, they were able to hunt big prey with much better success than the Cynodonts ever could. A massive theropod like Allosaurus or even early tyrannosaurids could take down herbivorous dinosaurs that were bigger than any Dicynodont that ever lived, and they could do it with an efficiency and deadliness that the early Triassic carnivores could never match. The Dicynodonts couldn't compete with this new predatory threat, and they started to get fewer in numbers in the middle and late Triassic before finally getting wiped out by the end of the period, leaving a world where carnivores were once again firmly in control and predators once again dominated herbivores through strength and hunting prowess. It's pretty fascinating to think about what might have happened if the Dicynodonts had kept evolving the way they were, if the early Triassic climate had settled differently, or if dinosaurs hadn't shown up when they did. Would herbivores have stayed dominant? Would we live in a world where big, peaceful grazers ran the show and predators stayed on the bottom? Probably not.
The competitive edge of being a predator is fundamental to ecology, and specialist hunters will generally outcompete generalist herbivores, given enough time and resources. But for a brief window in Earth's history, that fundamental rule got flipped on its head, and for a few million years, the meek inherited the Earth.
The early Triassic herbivores remind us that nature's rules aren't set in stone, and that under the right conditions, even the most bonkers scenarios can happen in the real world. These massive tusked creatures weren't vicious predators in the traditional sense, but they were effective rulers of their world through size, strength, weaponry, and sheer numbers. And for that brief moment in deep time, they proved that being a herbivore didn't mean being defenseless or on the bottom rung. It meant being dominant, and the carnivores had to accept being second-rate players in a world that belonged to the herbivores. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay extinct-minded, mate.